Okay, it is the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. This is the NTP working group at IETF 109. This is the IETF note well. For those of you who are new to the working group, you will have acknowledged and accepted this when you registered for the IETF. These are all of the rules and processes by which we operate. Please check into them and make sure you understand them. If you have any questions, feel free to ask Dieter or myself, or Eric, who is our responsible AD. With that, we have a pretty short agenda today. First of all, we have this part of it, the administrative and agenda bashing session. We're going to talk about a number of documents, what the status review is, and next steps for a number of documents that are in flight. These are documents that don't really have any updates. We will talk about the alternative NTP port document that was accepted recently. We'll talk. I put this down as IETF 109 hackathon and then put a rough time report, but it's actually both a report of what rough time did at the hackathon and also implications and next steps for the rough time draft itself. And then we'll talk about NTPv5 development, rechartering, and any other business. Is there any agenda bashing? No? Okay. The one thing I do need, is there anybody who's willing to take notes? Any minute takers? I know Dieter has agreed to do it, but it would be good if somebody else did it with him. It's going to be a very quiet meeting today. Okay. So Dieter, I guess you get the minutes.
I'll do it.
So the next, so the first part of the first agenda item is our NTP working group status. We have a couple documents that are with the IESG now. We have the Mode 6 commands and the Yang data model. So there's no updates to those yet. We also have two documents that are ready for the IESG that have not been submitted yet. One is the interlead modes document, and the second one is the NTP port randomization. And then I originally listed the next two documents as documents that we had no updates on, but we will have an update on rough time based on the hackathon. I just didn't move it off this list. So are there any questions or comments on these documents?
I can apologize for being slow on the AD evaluation parts.
No problem. I've had my own long list of things I'm slow on at the moment. Okay, so with that, the next part of the agenda is is Watson. He's going to talk about the Rough Time Hackathon experience. Go ahead, Watson.
I think you need to accept this screen. Oh, do you want to do the slides or?
Oh no, I'm happy to let you do them. I just here I'll stop sharing.
Okay. I think there's something you need to do to accept the queue.
Yeah. Yeah, I just got into the habit of doing them all myself, so I'm happy to defer to
So great, it looks like that's working. All right, so I'll be discussing the Rough Time Hackathon experience and the next steps in the protocol. I noticed that a number of people are new, so I'll give a quick recap of Rough Time. So it's essentially certificate transparency for time. By signing the responses and incorporating and non-submitted the queries, we can provide proof that the queries were responded to in a causal order. And the servers are attesting that the generation was within an interval. If these intervals are inconsistent with the evidence of causality, then we know that at least one server was lying when it said that it had generated the response at that time, and this can then lead to a distrust of the server. And this is intended to provide much stronger security guarantees for an approximate time with applications to signature verification. I've heard of interest in IoT, time synchronization security, obviously, but it's not going to be as accurate as you might want. It will, however, ensure that the time is correct. And one of the wrinkles in this is you need a monotonic time representation, because you want to have the case that you can compare the timestamps, and you'll always have a causally later timestamp be a numerically greater value. And to adopt this, we use a representation based on the modified Julian date and microseconds since midnight. So there's some bit packing that goes on where some of the bytes are allocated for microseconds since midnight and some are allocated to the modified Julian date. So I'm at the hackathon. So work at Cloudflare, and Cloudflare has a client and server implementation, and there's now a branch that implements the Rough Time version 3 draft. There's still work to be done on updating the interfaces with some of the changes that have happened in the draft and fixing some of the usability issues around the library that we provide. But that, general cleanup, but it does implement it. And the server interoperated with a client from Johan Lindquist. There were some issues we identified. So modified Julian date, in order to compute it, you need to know whether or not you're in a leap second. And that information is known to the kernel on Unix-like systems, but there is no portable interface to obtain it. So depending on exactly where you're implementing this, that can be an issue. Linux has an interface, sort of roundabout what you have to do, but it's there. And it's a matter of getting other operating systems to support some kind of nicely designed interface to get that information out. So what's remaining with the draft? So there's an area that's been a sort of to-do list for a while, which is the transfer of proofs of server malfeasance. We need to serialize them, and there needs to be some idea of where to send them. If you're interested in deploying Rough Time, I want to hear from you. Even something like "this is fine" would be very useful. I think at that point we'll sort of be ready for a working group last call. Didn't find any issues with interoperability, I don't think. from the draft text. So that's pretty nice. Some particular areas of concern. So I mentioned earlier that there was this problem with minimum with getting the information out of the kernel. Well, if you're that only changes the time by 1 second. So is having a server say, okay, I only know the time within a second, and just using get time of day enough, or maybe it needs to be a little bigger. With a modified Julian date representation, the arithmetic depends on leap second tables, because you need to know what the last second of the day is. And when there is I'm going to mess up the sign convention. I know whatever I say, it's going to be wrong. So when you have a second repeated, because the Earth has spun slower than expected, the last second of the day repeats, and you need to know what the last second's number is. There's also invalid representations. The number of seconds in a day is not a power of 2. And because it is not a power of 2, there are a number of values that should never appear. And the invitation when you program this is to do your arithmetic on a degenerate representation. Just take the microseconds part and add in the timestamp, normalize afterwards. This introduces differences in the results you get and implementation behavior. And so I need to say more about that. And then this wrinkle I thought of is sort of signature canonicalization. What happens if a server produces signatures that some parties verify and others do not? Can this be used to lie and get away with it? So that's sort of the standards thing. And I want to talk about barriers to deployment. Currently, the deployment picture is pretty bleak. There's a small number of earlier versions deployed, mostly of the Google version that was kicking around from Adam Langley. Not enough for the actual 3 servers. I think there's exactly one of them, and it's not working right now, and got restarted every day. And there need to be places to report malfeasance. And we also need clients. And just as this is a certificate verifying client needs to have policies on the certificates it verifies, or a certificate transparency implementate. A client that uses certificate transparency needs to trust certain logs. The client in rough time needs to have a policy about acceptable servers. And that is a bit of an obligation. And it's, so that is something that needs to at some point happen. So at this point, I think I'll open the floor to questions if there are any, because that's sort of done with the summary.
Okay, are there any questions?
I have a question. You mentioned some areas of concern, but you also mentioned that you think this draft is ready for working group last call. So.
Okay. I think I misspoke. What I said is I think that after those are addressed, it would be ready.
Okay. Thanks.
And if people see now I have ideas to address all of them, but if people think that no, these are actually bigger problems or they have input, now would be the time to speak up.
So Watson, during the hackathon, did you get any participants in your project?
Yes. Johan Lindquist showed up, and his client interoperates with the server. So that is good.
Okay. I saw that you were using his client. I guess I didn't make the connection. All right. Any other questions about rough time? do you have a rough estimate on the time that you think, like, what's your next plan for your next update?
I'd like to say as soon as the submission window reopens, but that's that might be me being too optimistic. Probably within the month.
Okay. I think the submission window reopens on the first day of the IETF meeting, doesn't it? I think that's today.
Okay, then. Well, I won't make that.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to. So there's no other questions on the rough time work? Okay. So on NTP v5 development work, we do not have a published draft. What we do have is a draft in GitHub. I'm going to put a couple links in the chat for people. So this is the contribution from Miroslav that will get submitted at some point. The other thing that I wanted to point people to was the track, the wiki, which we haven't updated in a while, but if you look at the wiki, there's potential NTP work items, and there's basically a list of version 4 issues and a version 5 feature requests. Miroslav is not on the call, so he can't really, at least let me double check. I didn't see him earlier. Yeah, I don't see him on the call at all. So I guess since Miroslav's not on the call, he can't talk to his contribution that was sent to the mailing list. Has anybody on the call read it and would like to discuss it?
Yeah, so Watson here. I read it. I sent a email to the mailing list with comments.
Oh.
I think at this point it's pretty early to say much about it. It's in part because it talks a lot about the data format, but doesn't talk about the algorithms for some of the more interesting extensions. But I think it's in I think it's in reasonably good shape for a starting point.
Okay. I think one of the concerns is it narrows the scope from NTP-v4, and we're gonna need to have a serious conversation about backward compatibility at some point.
I also think that
Go ahead.
that we should discuss some of the requirements for NTP version 5. So from my point of view, it might be important that NTP version 5 will start and secured association by default. But that at some point we have to discuss, I suppose.
Okay, Watson.
Yeah, I'm not sure what was meant by narrowing the scope. If I think there was some degree of agreement that we should specify the network the network wire format and the algorithms for steering somewhat independently. it basically split the current structure where it's algorithms for tuning the clock and the network protocol in one big document, and split it up in part because of operational experience where you can use other algorithms and it works fine.
Right, that's not actually what I meant. I do believe there was agreement to do that. I was in particular talking about like reducing it to server client mode only as opposed to supporting other types of operations, other modes of service. And I guess scope is not really the right word, but deprecating some features that are not being used as much now as but that are part of the original specification. So that's more what I meant by narrowing the scope. Any other comments on the NTP v5 development? We have a number of new participants here. So, I mean, feel free to speak out. If you have any questions at all. All right, the last thing that on the agenda was, oh, go ahead, Doug. Doug, did you intend to put yourself in the queue? Just hit the speak. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So I just wanted to follow up on that last comment about other modes of operation and the possibility of marking them as no longer recommended or something. I think this is a discussion worth having. We want backwards compatibility, but we could say we're phasing these modes out. They are allowed in this version, but they may not be in future versions. That's so deprecated might be appropriate, but that's a choice for this group to make. But I think that's a discussion we could have.
All right. I guess I guess what I've encouraged people to do would be to write drafts, even if they're not like protocol proposals, if they're drafts exploring what the requirements should be or those kinds of things. We've used the wiki over the years to try and collect all the requirements. But we aren't having a good, we haven't had enough discussion to make any consensus calls on like things like whether things should be deprecated or not. So it would be helpful to have some of that discussion. All right, anything else on NTP v5? Still don't see Miroslav. So the last point of the agenda was rechartering. We have been promising some rechartering text for a while, but we have not done that yet. I just had that open. I have created an Etherpad to start collaborating. We got some volunteers at our last virtual interim to work on the to work on some chartering text, and we did not make any progress on that. That's mostly my fault for not pulling it together. So what I'd like to do is work on that for the next virtual interim. And that's the wrong button. Too many buttons. With that, we are at the any other business. This is going to be the shortest NTP meeting ever. Eric, go ahead.
Can I ask if that Etherpad with the chartering in it, but the link was in the chat, or it could be in the chat.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
You said you had put some the charter text in Etherpad somewhere to be worked on.
I said I set up an Etherpad.
I was wondering
And
if the link was available. I think
yeah, and I had it like 30 minutes ago, and now I can't find it. It's somewhere in the millions. I will send it to the mailing list because I cannot find where I put it.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I set it up in advance of the meeting, but now I can't find it. Way too many tabs. All right. With that, are there any other questions? Any other business that we want to discuss? We will look at scheduling a virtual interim. In all likelihood, in mid-January. I don't know that it makes much sense to try and get it in December. At that point, hopefully we will have made some more progress on chartering and cleaned up some of our documents that we're trying to finish up. Any other questions? Okay, with that, I think we are done.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, Watson.
Karen,
Yes, teacher.
do you know where the recording is available?
For this,
Yeah.
it'll be on YouTube in a few days. I can send you the link afterwards.
Okay. I should also have the link, no? Should I?
Yeah. There's no way for us to end the session. Meet Echo has to end it. Oh, there we go.